Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, we have been working on this question of moral values. Where do moral values come from? And we began multiple weeks ago now looking at this question of objective moral values versus moral values. And remember, moral values we might define as the values that I live my life by. But objective moral values are values that would be true, would be objectively true, regardless of whether any human being believed them or not. They would simply be true. So I want to look at this question tonight, and again, we're going to bring back our old friend Richard Dawkins, and we're going to look at a couple more quotes from his naturalistic Ten Commandments that he's been quoting from. But I also want to look at a couple of other quotes as he starts drilling down on this idea of where do values come from. And then there is a need in his book. He addresses this need to address the idea and the concept of, are the actions of nation states that have embraced an atheist philosophy, are those actions representative of what happens when you remove God from the moral conscience? And he addresses that question in his book, The God Delusion. I want to address it here tonight as we look at that. So there's a couple of things. As Dawkins is talking about this, he begins building up by saying religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you'd have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. Now, would you have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things with or without religion? The answer is yes. But that's not the question. The question on the table is, when you build a system of values, of moral values upon which you base your society on, are those values better served on a foundation of objective moral values from a divine creator? Or do you get the same or better results building those moral values on a consensus? And where does that consensus go? And do we have any examples where you had a culture that was formerly a culture based in some sort of a religious system, that religious system was forcibly ripped from it and imposed upon it was then a very specific atheistic, naturalistic system, where we drove religion from the public square on purpose, and then can we look at the results of that? Now, Dawkins is going to later argue no, and we'll talk about that. But again, if we continue looking at Dawkins, he says, how then do we decide? Oh, wait, I want to go back a little bit further. He says, fortunately, however, morals do not have to be absolute. Okay, so he's addressing that question. Morals do not have to be absolute. But then he begins maybe pulling back a little bit on that. And he says, not all absolutism is derived from religion. Nevertheless, it is pretty hard to defend absolute morals on grounds other than religious ones. So when you base this question, and again, remember, we talked about last time this idea a few episodes ago. We quoted from Dawkins where he makes a comparison between cows and sheep and chimpanzees and human beings. And he basically says us being human beings does not confer upon us anything special compared to anything else on this planet because we all share a common evolutionary ancestor. Now, Dawkins, to his credit, he believes that, and from a strictly atheist perspective, he's correct. But you and I don't believe that. The vast majority of people, when you ask them that question, if you look in the mirror, if you look at somebody and say, are you worth more than a sheep or a chimpanzee? Their answer is going to be, well, of course I am. The vast majority of people believe that. But the question is, why is it true? It's absolutely true, but why is that true? And what we talked about in that episode is atheism struggles to put an answer on the table. From a strictly evolutionary naturalist perspective, there's not a good answer to put on the table as to why that might be. Dawkins continues, and he says, how then do we decide what is right and what is wrong? No matter how we answer that question, there is a consensus about what we do as a matter of fact consider right and wrong, a consensus that prevails surprisingly widely. Okay, so there is a consensus, generally speaking, but is that consensus built upon where we've traveled as a people through the evolutionary processes of where we've gone? Is it the product of a consensus, or is it the product of something that's been built into us that has so fundamentally changed with the injection of Judeo-Christian values into the world scene 2,000 years ago? That's going to be the real question as we look at this. So I want to address that as we look at this question of the next naturalistic commandment. And then as we look at these next two, I want you to see where this goes as we would then talk about it. Okay, so do not overlook evil or shrink from administering justice, but always be ready to forgive wrongdoing freely admitted and honestly regretted. Okay, so let's break that down into its two parts. Don't overlook evil or shrink from administering justice. So there's an idea here of we're not just going to overlook things. We're not going to shrink from administering justice. I think we can all agree on that. But always be ready to forgive wrongdoing freely admitted and honestly regretted. The problem that we have there is the freely admitted and honestly regretted part. You remember last week we talked about this idea of the golden rule. And again, I mentioned last week, the golden rule does not suggest you allow somebody to wrong you and to harm you or things like that. It doesn't. And that goes to the first part of this one. Don't overlook evil or shrink from administering justice. I get it. But the golden rule also says once you've extricated yourself from that situation, you do forgive them. And it doesn't include the caveat, freely admitted and honestly regretted. Because far too often when someone has wronged you, they don't always admit it and they don't honestly regret it. And when you look at, if you look at some relationships, let's say you have a parent who's done a really bad job raising their child, and their children look back on them later and just struggle terribly to forgive them of all the scars that they left. If you go back in that parent's life, the scars that they left on their child are probably the result of scars that were left on them by someone who did a really bad job of parenting them. So if you have somebody whose parents were just atrocious to them, and that made them really ill-equipped to be a parent, and they did the best they could, but they were a terrible parent to their children, are they going to honestly regret it and freely admit it? I don't know, maybe. They've got scars from their parents before them. So do you ever actually get to that place? Do you ever actually get to a place where you forgive wrongdoing, even if the other party doesn't ask for forgiveness, doesn't admit it, and doesn't really regret it? Because that was how they were raised. They don't see anything wrong with it. They carry their scars too. What's wrong with you? If that's how you're living your life, it's so much different than what we talked about last week with the golden rule. I don't want to rehash and go through all of that again. But it's such a very different bar than the bar that we see set in a Judeo-Christian system. I think we talked about before, Matthew 5, 43, 40, and 44. You have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. That's what it looks like living under grace. And it's such a dramatically different standard than what we see proposed here. It doesn't produce the same result because it's so much lower on the scale. How can it produce the same result? If you're going to wait, I'm not going to forgive someone unless they honestly admit it. They honestly recognize it. Now I've forgotten it. Freely admit it and honestly regret it. If that's the standard by which I forgive, how often am I really going to forgive? How is that really supposed to work as we go forward? It lowers the bar so much. When you look at our culture and say, okay, which is going to produce a better result as a culture as we build going forward? The golden rule or the commandment that Jesus just gave there in Matthew 5, or the standard that we've been given? Well, you can forgive people, but only if they admit it and they repent of it. You can see the shortcoming of that. You can see where that produces a much, much lower result. I want to look at this last one, and I want to talk about history and what's happened as we look at this. This last one is going to, I think, give you a real good example of the problem that we face in trying to do this. Form independent opinions on the basis of your own reason and experience. Do not allow yourself to be led blindly by others. Okay, so that sounds good on the surface. And I think we all look at that and recognize, yep, that's one I could do. But there ought to be a glowing problem in all of this we all recognize. When people have been led blindly by others and led to make bad decisions, how often do they recognize that they're being led blindly by others and they're making bad decisions? not until after the bad decisions are made, and then again, only if there's some self-reflection involved there. The crowd mentality, the gang mentality that you see develop sometimes out there, when you see that come together, you oftentimes have people who have been led blindly by others, led blindly by lies or hatred or some sort of a dislike of someone, that whether or not it's true, whether or not it's deserved, there is this horrible mentality that develops around that. And people are oftentimes misled into making bad decisions. So saying that we shouldn't be misled misses the obvious point that we frequently are. And the first part of this, form independent opinions on the basis of your own reason and experience. My own reason and experience, and at times, don't get me wrong, you should test everything. As you form opinions, you should test those against something. So this is the problem with basing our moral values on our own experience, our moral values on our own set of standards. What could possibly go wrong with that? Again, what if my basis of experience is not that large? What if I am 18 years old and really I think I know everything in the world, because when I was 18, I thought I knew everything, but I didn't. Am I better served building my life on a foundation of objective moral values that raise my eyes to a higher standard? Or am I better off building my moral values on a foundation of my experiences? My experiences are probably right, but most of us recognize that's not true. Like I said a few episodes ago, I'm on the north side of 50 now. My life experiences are dramatically different now that I'm in my 50s as opposed to when I was in my early 20s. My realization of the world around me is so vastly different. And I am such a very different person now than I was then. When I look at that, had I lived my life strictly by the standard of form independent opinions on the basis of my own reason and experience, if all I base that on is me, then how is that ever going to be as good as, and again, I want to be very clear when I say this. If I base my moral values on that system, form independent opinions on the basis of my own reason and experience, how is that going to work out compared to forming my opinions, the foundation for my opinions on a set of objective moral values from a higher standard? Now, I know the argument's going to be, well, wait a minute. There's multiple competing systems out there, and lots of people have lots of issues with those religious systems. So how do you know the right one to choose? What if you choose wrong? You're blindly choosing based on faith. It is critically important that you ground your moral values on the right answer. Absolutely agree with you on that. But if I recognize that I'm not the ultimate authority in the universe, and I recognize a higher standard that is greater than me, a higher standard that has proven himself to me, and we'll get there. I'm putting on the table the alternative answer. If I base my moral values on that foundation rather than my own reason and experience, and then again, I shape my future going forward on that. My reason and experience grow based on a foundation that is rock solid, not on a foundation that shifts over time as I grow and change. My moral values need to be built on something greater than me, because I'm not the ultimate moral authority. I have no problem admitting that. But what happens? So what happens if you actually do build your moral values on that foundation? Now, I want to stress, Richard Dawkins absolutely disagrees with this point. And when we look at the history of the 20th century, you've got some real problems that start to develop for this idea. Because what we have are a lot of examples, many examples, where we see that religion was removed from the public square by force. And starting in the early 1900s with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, what we saw from Lenin and then Stalin, and then in China under Mao, and then in other subsequent regimes going forward, was the forced removal of religion and any idea of religion from the public square. Now, as we've discussed this, again, I want to go back to Dawkins' quote. I want to go back to Dawkins' quote where we started with. Religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you'd have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. So if that is true, then if we removed religion from that situation, we should expect a better result. We should expect a better outcome than what we saw. Because what we've seen is a weakening of religion throughout Western Europe, but not a removal of religion. And so if we're really going to test the theory, if we're really going to test this idea that religion is actually the root cause of one of the problems, then it's entirely reasonable to say, then what has happened historically when we've done that? And I'm just going to give you the numbers, strictly by the numbers. From Soviet Russia, Stalin and Lenin and other communist leaders, estimates are 61 million Russian people killed by their regime. 61 million people. China, Mao Zedong, 78 million dead. 78 million people. The Khmer Rouge, millions of people again. Various North Korean dictators. We don't know the numbers, but we know it's massive. When you look at these regimes that have publicly, forcefully removed God from the equation, what has been the result? The deaths of not just millions, but tens of millions of people. Now, Dawkins answers this, and he says, what matters is not whether Hitler and Stalin were atheists, but whether atheism systematically influences people to do bad things. There's not the smallest evidence that it does. And then a few pages later, he says, individual atheists may do evil things, but they don't do evil things in the name of atheism. Okay, this is where I vehemently disagree with that statement. They did what they did in the name of the atheist state that they were running. In the name of communism, they removed religion from the public square, and then they took the next steps. As they removed religion, what was the end result? Russia, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, worked under the church. It was a Christian nation under the Eastern Orthodox Church. When you remove that, what was the outcome? Now, you can say, as Dawkins has, the outcome had nothing to do with atheism. But when you look at what Lenin did, when you look at what Stalin did, it was forced atheism. It was aggressive atheism at the hands of removing any and all ideas of religion. And this is where I understand we don't like to make the comparison. But when you look at it, and as we looked at Dawkins' quote from a few weeks ago, and we equate human beings, chimpanzees, cows, and sheep, and we say, quoting from Dawkins, the humanness of an embryo's cells cannot confer upon it any absolute, discontinuous moral status. It cannot because of our own evolutionary continuity with chimpanzees and more distantly with every species on the planet. When you take that standpoint and you equate human beings with sheep and with cows and chimpanzees, how is it that we are not to equate the end results of those philosophical political systems with the atheism that they were built on? Because what stands in the way of that is this idea that we are all created in the image of our Creator. That is how we have this idea of inalienable rights. This is how we have this idea stated in the Declaration of Independence that we're all created equal. When you remove that, and you as a person become inconvenient to the political state, to the apparatus, when you become inconvenient, you simply disappear. And those numbers rank in over 100 million lives lost. Now, I know I saw this in some of the comments from a few weeks ago. People said, you cannot make that comparison. You can't go there and do that. Civilizations that have removed God, they do quite well on their own. They do just fine. And civilizations built on Christianity, Christians have committed atrocities too. And that's true. They have. Christians have done so despite the commandment to the contrary. But when you base your moral foundation on a system that has removed religion from the public square, and you've built a consensus without it, what was going to stop the slaughter of 61 million people in the Soviet Union or 78 million people in China. Source for that is in the show notes. What stops that? When you look at that, what is it that stops that? And we can say all day long, that's not a fair comparison. And again, like Dawkins' point, they didn't do that for atheism, was his exact quote. I want to quote him correctly on this. What matters is not whether Hitler and Stalin were atheists, but whether atheism systematically influences people to do bad things. The problem is when you remove the filters that recognize that we are something special, that we are more than sheep, that we are more than chimpanzees. When you remove that, what is it that stops the state from doing that? And the problem that you have to address is, how can you say the example is not a good one? Because what you saw was the forced removal of religion, and then you saw the outcome, and you say, well, but those two had nothing to do with each other. Really? What was it that stopped it before? How did it then happen? And we can make excuses all day long, but the reality is, as we see this is the problem. Now, you can say, this is not a good example and those aren't fair to do. Next week, what we're going to do, this is a good time to stop. Next week, what we're going to do is we're going to bring in another example and we're going to ask the question, why? This is the problem. You have to build moral values on a foundation. What is the basis for moral values? Objective moral values have a basis that we recognize. If you don't do that, and your moral values are based on a consensus, then where does that consensus lead us? Dawkins was quoted from later in the book as saying, in the previous chapter, when trying to explain the shifting moral zeitgeist, I invoked a widespread consensus of liberal, enlightened, decent people. And I'm sure as the Bolshevik Revolution began, there were a great many of liberal, enlightened, decent people. But over time, it went to a place that was not so liberal, enlightened, or decent. Because once those values, once those foundations are removed, then what's holding us together becomes something very, very different. And what happens when the consensus is, let's do something really horrible? That's what we're going to look at next week. I hate it. It's not a very upbeat conclusion to the episode, but I hope this episode's made you think. And I hope this episode has been helpful. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Next week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the ultimate example of what happens when consensus building goes wrong. And we'll see where this goes. And we'll see whether or not Dawkins is right or whether or not history tells a very different story. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting that like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. You can reach out to us at prooftograceyahoo.com if you've got questions, and you can find helpful information on our website at prooftograce.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.